This is the launch of TASO's new Mapping of Outcomes and Activities tool, or the MOAT. You will notice that this is a webinar format on Zoom, so your cameras are off, you don't have microphones, you won't be able to unmute yourself and speak. Don't worry, that is how it's meant to be, so there's nothing wrong at your end, but you should be able to see a Q&A question and answer function on your screen, and we will leave time for questions at the end of the session today, so please do feel free to drop any questions that you have as we present to you today, and we'll kind of mop those up and answer as many as we can at the end of the session. I'm going to go ahead and get us started as people continue to join. So first of all, by way of a round of introductions, I am Rain Sherlock. I'm the head of evaluation at TASO, and I'm joined today by TASO colleagues. So you will hear from Sarah Connor, our research manager, and also from Nicolette, who's our evaluation officer here at TASO. We're also joined by colleagues from the 3 national tracking services in HE. So you're going to hear from Anna Anthony, the co-director of HEAT, also from Emma Church, the partnership manager at MREP, and finally from Catty Ferreira, who's the evaluation, research and data manager at Aim Higher West Midlands. And you'll hear from each of them towards the end of our session today as well. So to give you just a brief outline of how we're going to use our time, in a moment I'll talk you through just a really simple high-level intro to TASO for anyone who's not familiar with us and the work that we do. I'm then going to hand over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to give you a bit of background information to the Mapping of Outcomes and Activities tool, or the MOAT, and how we developed it. And then over to Nicolette, who's going to talk you through quite a practical example of how to implement the MOAT or mapping tool in your own context. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll hear from each of the national tracking services about the work that they're doing to integrate the MOAT into their dashboards and tracking facilities so that their members can use and pick up the MOAT in useful ways. For those of you who have just joined, we do have a Q&A function, a question and answer function. So please do feel free to drop your questions throughout the session as we talk, and then we'll mop those up at the end of the session and answer as many as we can. But let's go ahead and get started. So a quick reminder for anyone who's not familiar. So we are TASO, we're a higher education kind of hub for toolkits, guidance, resources to help the HE sector evaluate the types of interventions and activities that they deliver to students. And that's both kind of pre-entry work, but also post-entry student success. Today's session is mostly focused on kind of pre-entry mapping of outcomes and activities. We are an independent charity at TASO, and we were set up a number of years ago by a consortium of King's College London, Nottingham Trent University and a behavioural insights team. We then span out back in 2021, and we're now an independent charity that sits in the Evidence Quarter in London, and we're an affiliate What Work Centre. And there are about 9 of these What Work centres across the UK Government and Cabinet Office, and they're used to kind of build evidence and research and bolster policy and practice implementation in a number of different areas. But of course, we are focused solely on higher education and reducing equality gaps. For anyone who has joined TASO webinars in the past, this slide I think will be quite familiar or becoming quite familiar to you. This is what we call our monitoring and evaluation framework at TASO. And it's just a cycle of the 4 key phases to the evaluation life cycle. So we start in the diagnose phase, where we build a theory of change. We move on to plan and think about things like research questions and outcome measures and how we'll design our evaluation. We then move on to measure and collect data against our theory of change and the key research questions that we're interested in. And then finally, of course, we kind of reflect on the findings and write up the report and try to mobilize that knowledge. And what's demonstrated by the kind of circular motion of this slide is that it's a cycle that continues. So once you get to that 4th and final phase of reflect, you can feed those findings back into phase 1 and revisit your theory of change. But today, and the reason that I present this slide is that I quite like to situate the content that we're going to be talking about within this evaluation cycle. And the mapping of outcomes and activity tool is primarily of use to you in that first diagnose phase. So as you'll see over the course of the next kind of 45, 50 minutes, is how you can usefully implement the MOAT to be able to help you build your theory of change, but also it can play a role in the plan phase in helping you identify outcomes and therefore outcome measures as you plan your evaluation. So that's quite a kind of rapid and high-level intro, but let's get stuck into the kind of interesting content. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sarah to give you a bit of background context.
Thanks very much, Rain. So yeah, we thought it would be helpful to provide a bit of background about how this tool came about, really. And some of you may have been at our launch in May, so a good few months ago, where we did talk about this. So some of this might be familiar to you. But over the last few years, we've been working with 3 universities to try and evaluate multi-intervention outreach programs. So these are resource-intensive programs. They combine a range of activities. So, for example, summer schools or campus visits, workshops, mentoring, a range of activities over a sustained period of time. So, for example, you might have a program that's working with Year 12 and Year 13 students over a period of 2 years. But we know from our evidence review that was conducted a couple of years ago, sorry, Rain, still on the former slide, that we're lacking evidence on their effectiveness. So we have a lot of correlational evidence, which shows that these programs are associated with positive outcomes. So, for example, positive attitudes towards HE and also enrolment in HE, but we don't know for definite these programs are causing those outcomes. So we're lacking that sort of causal evidence, which is why this project came about, is we want to build the evidence on these multi-intervention outreach programs, and also sort of pick apart these programs, because often the evidence for these programs is how they work as a whole, not how sort of individual activities might interact, or the best combination of activities, which links to how best we evaluate these programs, these multi-intervention activities. So we work with 3 universities, as I said, so Aston University, King's College London and the University of Birmingham, and they ran slightly different programs for different year groups, with sort of some overlap of activities, but in some cases some differences as well. And we had a local evaluation at each of those universities to understand the impact of their programs. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail there, because you can read those project reports available on our website. We launched those in May. But what is really important to the context of this webinar is that we mapped the commonalities and differences between the programs, and that led to us forming the MOAT, or the Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool, to understand the different activities being delivered across these programs, but also developing common evaluation and measurement frameworks for these programs. So that's how the MOAT, the mapping tool, came about. And we then wanted to understand how best to disseminate these tools to the sector, which is how we've ended up working with the 3 trackers to ensure that the tools that we're developing, these evaluation and measurement frameworks, are actually being used consistently across the sector. Well, that's what we hope to happen anyway. So this is, in a sense, what the MOAT looks like, the Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool. So I have split it into sections, and I appreciate the writing will be reasonably small on your screens, but this is more just to give a visual overview, so that when you see it on our website, you can see what it looks like, you know what to look out for. But the MOAT includes broad activity types, so such as general, HE, information, advice and guidance. And then this is split into subtypes of activities. So, for example, focusing specifically on finance, or UCAS, or personal statements. But you will see that we've got a box here as a placeholder for skills and attainment. So we had feedback from the sector that this was particularly warranted, and we needed a sort of more granular mapping, particularly related to skills and attainment. So what specific activities lead to increased attainment, which we know is linked in the evidence to enrolment in higher education. So the sector felt it was really important that we sort of spin that out of this tool to really pick up the granular detail of those activities. So at the moment, when we launched in May, that was just a placeholder. But what the tool also includes is different outcomes. So these were developed in conjunction with those 3 university partners that we worked with, but also in workshops with the sector. So we have a range of outcomes that make up the tool. And again, I appreciate these will be small on your screen, but it's just to look out for the colours and what it looks like. But our greeny, sort of turquoise colours are our behavioural outcomes. So these are things like attendance or communication skills. But we also have our non-behavioural outcomes, which tend to be psychosocial constructs that you'd measure with surveys. So, for example, self-efficacy or a sense of belonging. So those are represented in the pink and red colour. And we've also got that temporal split. So the little S's that you can see in the circles, if that's clear to you, they represent short-term outcomes, but we also have intermediate outcomes and our longer-term outcomes, which are related to increasing applications to an enrolment in HE. But you'll also see that we still have those placeholders there for the attainment-raising outcomes. So we don't yet include outcomes that are specifically related to increased attainment. So we still needed to work on this. And this is what our pre-entry MOAT, as we're calling it, the pre-entry mapping outcomes and activities tool looks like as the visual diagram. So again, very small on your screens, but this is just so you can look out for this in its entirety on our website. So getting to the sort of attainment raising part that this sort of spin-off tool, as we're calling it, this was a real collaboration between ourselves, but also the National Tracking Service, who are here today, which is brilliant, and also the Office for Students. So this took place over several months, really trying to focus on what specific activities are related to attainment, so things like tutoring or revision workshops, and what intermediate outcomes link to attainment. So, for example, academic self-efficacy or increased cognitive functioning. So that we worked on this for several months, and we also had feedback from the Uni Connect partnerships and the Causeway Education community of practice. So Causeway Education were commissioned by the Office for Students to develop a toolkit on attainment raising. So it was really important to get their input into this to understand whether the activities and subtypes of activities that we were including in this tool, as well as the outcomes, accurately sort of reflected what was going on in the sector. So this is how the attainment raising tool came about. And this is what it looks like. So it's very similar to our pre-entry MOAT, and we're calling it our attainment raising MOAT. So it's like a little spin-off from the pre-entry MOAT, and you can see again it's very similar. It has your broad activity type, which is focused specifically on skills and attainment. And this is broken down into different subtypes, such as homework support or an academic summer school. And then again, your outcomes split by behavioural as well as non-behavioural. So those are our 2 tools that we have running at the moment. So I appreciate that's quite a lot of info and visuals and colours to take in. So sort of breaking down now what we're expecting these mapping tools to be used for across the sector, and sort of what is this tool. So I think what I haven't mentioned yet is actually the mapping. So what is the mapping element of this tool? So far I've just described sort of the outcomes and activities. So it's designed to be a tool that as it says in the title, maps activities across to outcomes. Sorry, the animation's not on my screen yet. So for example, one activity we've got is an HE campus visit. So actually going to visit a provider. If we then split this by one of our activity subtypes, we might have an open day. So a specific open day. And then when students actually go to an open day, what's the outcome most linked to this? So for example, we might have knowledge of HE. So it's really trying to create that granular mapping of splitting up these activities that make up broader programs and pinpointing exactly what outcomes are linked to these. And the key here is creating consistency across the sector in how we label the activities, how we code these activities, and how we're tracking students through those outcomes. So the two tools that we've got at the moment are for pre-entry, as I've said, so widening participation, outreach interventions, and then that specific spin-off MOAT, mapping outcomes and activities tool, which is focused specifically on attainment. So we, sorry, 1 second, Ryan, back to the other one. We are looking to explore whether we can do something similar for post-entry activities as well, but at the moment, our two tools are designed for pre-entry and specifically on attainment as well. And as I've said, we really want to try and ensure that consistent labelling and recording of outcomes and activities across the sector. And the key here is so we can build the evidence. So if everyone's labelling everything in a similar way and using the trackers, as will become clear in their sections later on in this webinar, we'll be able to facilitate more robust evaluation and build that evidence. So alongside the sort of visual diagram is our practical spreadsheet. So this is something that can be downloaded from our website as well. And in that spreadsheet, the first tab that we have explains the activity types and subtypes. So you'll see along the top, for example, we have HE, information, advice and guidance, and then split by those subtypes. So finance, course choice, and things like that. So you might choose multiple subtypes within the activity type. So by no means do you need to just choose one subtype, because I imagine for your activities that you will deliver IAG on things like finance, as well as personal statements, as well as course choice. So that's our first tab. Our second tab is focused specifically on outcomes. So you'll notice here that there is the temporal split as well. And this is really important because some activities are unlikely to increase, let's say, application to HE on their own. It's more likely to be a cumulative effect. So for example, one campus visit might increase knowledge about the benefits of HE, so a short term, but cumulatively that will build up, hopefully, to our increased application to HE. So we have short-term outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and long-term outcomes. And these are again split between behavioural and non-behavioural. I think it's worth saying here that those outcomes have been developed. Sorry, Brain, just back to the outcome bins a second. These outcomes have been developed in conjunction with our 3 university partners on the project, but we also did hold workshops with a range of sort of practitioners and evaluators to identify common outcomes associated with outreach activities. It's not to say that this is a completely exhaustive list of all of the outcomes that you could possibly choose in this space, but we felt it was important to confine to the most common outcomes, again, to ensure that sort of consistency in how we're labelling outcomes, how we're measuring the impact of our activities so that we can build that evidence. And then on our third tab, we have the mapping. So this is where, based on our experience working on a few projects at TASO, but also based on the evidence that is out there through an evidence review, we've mapped the most relevant outcomes that we believe are most linked to these activities. So you can see along the right, we have those 4, or in some cases 3 or 4 outcomes that most link to those activities. So that's where that mapping element comes in. So for example, going to a subject taster session is likely to increase knowledge of academic life, increase knowledge of course choice. So really picking apart what intermediate and long-term outcomes are linked to specific activities rather than the whole programs as a whole. And it's also worth noting that we have definitions of each of the activities and outcomes that can be accessed through the 4th tab on the spreadsheet as well. So when should you use this tool? When's the ideal way to use the tool in terms of your evaluation planning? So Rain alluded to this in her earlier slides, that ideally you'd use this to develop a theory of change for your outreach program or activity. So when you're populating a theory of change, you choose the appropriate activity types and subtypes, as well as the associated short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes based on our mapping, to populate that theory of change and start that journey of evaluation. But it's worth noting, if you already have a theory of change, it will still be useful to use this tool to review what you've included in your theory of change and really interrogate those causal pathways, so the links between activities and outcomes and how they align with our mapping that we've done. So to make this even clearer in your mind, I'm going to hand over to Nicolette, who's going to go through a practical example of how this tool is used within a theory of change.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning to all. So as Sarah alluded, I will be going through 2 examples. And this particular first example, I will be describing how the mapping outcomes and activity tool can be used to develop a theory of change. So on your screen, you can see what is the format of a usual typical theory of change, with the skeletal type of elements being situation, aims, impact, outcomes, outputs, activities, inputs, rationale, and assumptions. So if we think about the situation, this is our problem. So let's just imagine a hypothetical scenario where disadvantaged and underrepresented students encounter additional obstacles in their journey to access higher education. Specifically, they will encounter reading and literacy challenges, which can then further exaggerate the disparities within academic attainment. But not only that, but weak reading and literacy skills often then become a significant barrier for these students, hindering them achieving good GCSE grades and thereby limiting their path to higher education and aspirations to enter higher education institutions. So this is my situation, is the problem. From here, I then think about my aims, which would be to raise the Key Stage 3 attainment in selected schools, but also promoting higher academic standards and boosting student confidence. And then my second aim would then be to introduce students to higher education and then offering insights into the educational pathways and career possibilities. So once I've then kind of thought about my aims, from here, I'm going to think about what I want my impact to be. So thinking that through, based on my problem, I want my impact to improve attainment in English at Key Stage 3 for underrepresented and disadvantaged students, but also increase the likelihood of underrepresented and disadvantaged students progressing to HE. Now, we want to think about what outcomes, either short, intermediate, or long-term, will enable us to reach our intended impact. And here is now where the mapping outcomes and activity tool comes into play. So in this screenshot, you can see the outcomes bin, but this one is part of the attainment-raising mapping outcomes and activities tool practical spreadsheet. So firstly, I'm going to think about what type of outcomes I want to select from this particular tab. So the first one being from this short-term behavioral, being increased student engagement with academic studies. I've chosen this particular outcome because thinking it through, students are more likely to participate in the learning process actively when they're more engaged, which will then facilitate a deeper understanding of the subject and English. So then again, thinking about what my impact would be, I would think that would be a suitable outcome. So then I now think about the next one being increased subject knowledge specific to English. And then again, rationale being that a deeper understanding of the English language will enable students to comprehend the text more effectively, leading to better responses in exams and assignments. And then I think about the next one being maybe possibly improved reading skills. Again, I'm thinking, reading skills fosters critical thinking, analytical skills, but it also then leads to better comprehension and, again, better academic performance, which, thinking back to what my impact to be, would work. And then I think about the next one being increased academic self-efficacy. So with self-efficacy, students that have higher self-efficacy will believe more in their ability to succeed in certain academic tasks, this will then motivate them to put more effort into their learning. And again, thinking this sounds like if over time, this would lead to my impact. And then my next one for long-term behavioral outcome would be an increase in Key Stage 3 attainment. Why? Students with higher Key Stage 3 results are more likely to aspire to go to higher education, as greater academic success can boost their confidence, and then they can progress to HE. So again, this is now thinking about leading to my second impact that I've thought of for my program. And then lastly, the last one being increased sense of belonging. So again, when students feel a sense of fitting in, they're more likely to perceive fewer barriers or obstacles to pursuing HE. And these are my selected outcomes from the attainment-raising part of the MOAT, I think will work. So now at this point, now we can populate our outcomes column with the selected outcomes we've just selected from the outcome bin. And now we start to think about, well, which activities we believe can help us achieve these selected outcomes. And now we're thinking about this element that Sarah said about mapping. So again, I'm now going to go to the mapping tab of the MOAT spreadsheet, and this can help me do this. So in this mapping tab, again, we want to re-identify the relevant outcomes we hope to achieve for students. So here, the outcome of improved reading skills is linked back to literacy sessions, but also the other outcome we selected, increased subject knowledge for English and increased academic self-efficacy, are linked to subject-specific tutoring. So I've got two activities here, literacy sessions and subject-specific tutoring. I'm now going to add these to my activities column in my theory of change. So what I'm going to do here is now think, okay, well, it's subject-specific tutoring, literacy skills. I'm going to flesh this out a bit more and then think about actually my activities for my intervention will be holding 12 small group-based tutoring sessions in literacy and English, delivered in a 1-hour segment weekly. And I'm even going to take this even further and think, actually, I want student ambassadors to deliver it, hosting these sessions with these Key Stage C students for 1 hour weekly for 12 weeks. And that is my activities. Now, if we now go back and look back at our activities column in this highlighted green box, you can see in bold, black, the most relevant outcomes linked to our activities, which we just got from our mapping tab. But we're also still interested in the other outcomes that we selected from our outcomes bin, such as increased student engagement with academic studies, which could be a proxy measure for success in our evaluation, but also increased sense of belonging as well, with Key Stage 3 attainment being a key outcome indicator I will be looking out for in my program. So, and now we can start to develop our theory of change a bit more. So looking back now, starting back from the situation, which was an issue of weak literacy skills among underrepresented students being a barrier to them progressing to HE. I then thought about my aims. I then went to our impact section and then back mapped the process from our impact being that we want to improve attainment in English and increase the likelihood of progressing to HE. We then opened our attainment-raising MOAT practical spreadsheet and chose the outcomes, again, the ones that were highlighted in bold, that were most likely to lead to our intended impact. And then at that point, we then chose our outputs, which would then, we would then look at our outputs, which would be the number of books read or the number of hours spent reading, and then think about our inputs being both tangible and non-tangible, such as venue hire, having age-appropriate reading and funding. And then lastly, we would then look at our rationale and assumptions, and with these being the why and the how, that would explain the sequential, the causal pathway between inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. So this is how the MOAT comes into play here. But pause, we can apply the MOAT in the opposite way. So let me explain. So in the previous example, we started with the impact and outcomes section of the theory of change. And then we mapped backwards to the activities we thought would help us achieve these outcomes. But in other words, basically what we have done, sorry, Ray, next slide. But basically, in other words, what we have done is selected the outcomes we want to achieve for the students. And then we've selected from there the relevant activities from that point. And the rationale behind choosing these activities, again, could be based on a gap that exists or on risk identified. So from those identifying the risk to equality of opportunities risk register, otherwise known as EOR. So again, these activities then can be linked back to the associated, the outcomes can then be linked back to the associated activities to help us design our program intervention. But like I said, you could use it in the reverse order. So instead of mapping to activities, you could map activities to outcomes. And this is our second example. So again, you can map activities to outcomes. So you can be activity-led. So let's just say, for example, we have a pre-established intervention within our institution already. So we have a set of activities that we're already doing. So our program would then be like a widening participation tutoring scheme that delivers tutoring sessions online on a weekly basis with key stage 3 students. That's again being delivered by these student ambassadors. But it's been a program that's been established for 5 years now, and your program manager has tasked you with the task of developing a theory of change and evaluation task, because they want to know what works and what makes a difference to students. And that's what you've been tasked with. And this is again where the MOAT can come into play. So thank you. So in this instance, what you would do is identify the activity type, so being skills and attainment, and then the subtype for that particular activity for which your existing intervention falls within. So for me, I would think that it's some type of literacy session with subject-specific tutoring. And then I would want to double check my understanding of what actually literacy sessions or subject-specific tutoring is. And this is where the definition section for our practical spreadsheet comes into play, because I can look at literacy sessions here and then be like, okay, literacy sessions is a structured interactive session to help students develop their reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills, so forth, so forth. But then I can also look at the subject-specific tutoring side. Sorry, Ren, can you just click twice, please? And think subject-specific tutoring is tutoring delivered through repeated interactions and sustained engagement, focusing on providing additional support in a specific academic subject. And again, thinking to myself, actually, that sounds like kind of what my tutoring program is at the moment. So boom, this is what my activity subtype is. So once we've identified this, we can then go back to our mapping tab and then again, think about what outcomes would be most relevant to our activity that we may have already observed or what we think maybe would happen. And for subject-specific tutoring, this would be increased subject knowledge, but also for literacy session, it may be improved reading skills. And then if you think back again, some specific tutoring, increased academic self-efficacy, but also increased academic motivation. So here you can see that in this particular example, we have gone from having a predefined intervention that we're already doing at institution. The most still relevant here because we can use it to identify the types of activities we're doing, but then actually map to the outcomes that we either observe or think happens, and then we can either disprove or improve that. So thank you. I will now pass over back to Rain.
Thank you so much, Nicola and Sarah. So what you have just heard is a kind of very practical walkthrough of the different types of guidance and tools that are available via the kind of standard TASO evaluation guidance. So you've been shown a general pre-entry mapping tool and also an attainment-raising mapping tool, and both the colourful diagrams and both the practical spreadsheets, and it's all very applied. What we have also then done is hand these mapping tools over to the 3 national trackers. And actually, in the case of the attainment raising tool, we very much built that collaboratively with the national trackers. And each of those tracking services have then integrated it into the sort of back-end functionality or operationalization of the different activities, outcomes, behavioral, non-behavioral. And what we'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time for anybody who is joining us today as a member of Aim Higher West Midlands or MREP or HEAT, and give you a demonstration of what you can use those services for to maintain consistency and codification in how you're applying different outcomes to different activities. So I'm first going to hand over to Anna from HEAT to talk you through the example of their integration.
Thanks, Rain. Hi, everyone. So I am going to spend the next 5 minutes or so showing you how to use the MOAT within HEAT, because following our winter technical update, which actually was released to the live database just yesterday, the MOAT has now been integrated into our HEAT system for members to use. So on my next slide, I'll show you how that looks. So the part of HEAT that we've integrated the MOAT into is our evaluation plans tool. And the evaluation plans tool on HEAT, as the name suggests, is where you create and plan and record a plan for your evaluation. So part of this process is to create a theory of change, which includes adding outcomes. And the MOAT integration, still on that one, thanks, Jane. So the MOAT integration now supports you to select the most appropriate outcomes for the activity you're evaluating. And using HEAT's evaluation plans tool to record your whole evaluation plan, you can then link that plan to your data on delivery, which you're already recording on HEAT anyway. And then my last point on this slide is just to say that we've aligned our evaluation plans tool with the Office for Students Access and Participation Plan intervention strategy template that they're asking all providers to with APPs to populate. So that's the template on page 38 of Regulatory Advice 6. So by doing that, we're making reporting on your APP as easy as possible if you use our evaluation plans tool and record your data consistently through our system. We've actually got a webinar next week that demos a lot of that in action, so we'll give out the details to that at the end. But now, returning to the MOAT integration specifically, I'm going to show you some screenshots. So when you click on the Add Outcome button within the Evaluation Plans tool, you'll be presented with a box. So previously it was a free text field where you wrote in your own outcomes, but now you have this wizard. So you would start by selecting an activity type from the first drop-down list that the arrow is pointing to. So therefore the wizard follows the process of mapping activities to outcomes, which is the order that Nicolette showed you in her second scenario. And you can see on the screen here that these activities align with HEAT's main activity types. And in this example here, I've selected non-HEIAG. And then on my next slide, you can see that you would then go on to the next drop-down box, which is called MOAT subtype, and that provides the subtype activities that sit under those main types. So here you can see all of the different subtypes under that non-HEIAG main type, but the subtype list would be different, obviously, depending on the main type you selected. And but in this example, I've selected post-16 options. And then next, the next slide, you'll see that you're presented with the outcomes that have been mapped to that subtype in the MOAT. So here you can see the outcomes that are linked to post-16 options, and then you can tick on the ones you want. And then you will see in the next slide that these two I've ticked on here then appear there in your wizard. So the next field, which is being pointed to by the green arrow there, then allows you to select any different outcomes from the MOAT if you'd like to. So this relates to the point that Nicolette raised earlier, which is that there isn't currently sufficient evidence to comprehensively map activities to all of the outcomes that they could influence, but it's certainly theoretically possible that some other outcomes could be affected by those activities. So therefore, to help us collect outcomes using consistent terminology and build up the evidence, we would encourage everyone to record the outcomes that they think they're influencing using this section if they don't already appear as part of that mapping. So by clicking on that ellipsis, you can see this list of outcomes here from the MOAT. This is just a selection of an example. And then I've ticked on 2 there. And then when I close that, the next screen shows that they will then appear there in your wizard. And then the final option is this field called bespoke outcomes. And this allows you to record your own free text outcomes if you'd like to, if there are outcomes that you've identified and included in your theory of change which don't appear in the MOAT. So these could be quite specific, like I've included an example related to STEM career pathways here, and you would just type those in as free text. So my next slide then shows you how our evaluation plans tool goes on to ask you how you will measure each outcome you've listed. The process that I went through on the previous slides, where we used the add outcomes wizard, generated those outcomes you can see on the left there. The system then asks you to say which methods you are using by choosing one of the methods there under methodology, and then also complete some more information about the nature of that data collection, which you can see in the bottom right there under the survey option, which is ticked on. So the system would prompt you to record that for each of the outcomes listed, and you can select multiple methods for each one if that's what you're doing. So that allows you to keep a record of how you plan to measure each outcome. Before I move on to the next slide, I should just say that all of these fields are optional. So you can just add all free text outcomes if you want to, or you can use the MOAT entirely to generate all of your outcomes if you want to. It's really flexible. Right, so this slide is my last main slide, and it shows you how this MOAT integration and the evaluation plans tool fits into the wider HEAT system. So this diagram on the left shows the evaluation process separated into 4 stages: planning, targeting, recording and monitoring, and then analysing impact. And then on the right, you can see the different tools and features within HEAT that align with each of these. So each of these evaluation stages can be linked together using the activity record. That's the key record within HEAT. So that therefore links your plans to your data on delivery, and then again to your analysis and your impact reporting that when it comes to the HEAT track, we provide through dashboards for you. So even if you don't use HEAT to create your evaluation plans, it's very important that you record them on HEAT so that you can then refer back to them once that data on delivery from each of these stages becomes available. And then on my last slide, I'm just going to signpost to this webinar. So this is, we're going to show you a lot of all of this in action. So this is our HEAT webinar, which is happening a week today, during which we'll be giving a live demo of the evaluation plans tool, including all new functionality that we've listed there. And we're very grateful to have Rain, who will be joining us to also talk about the MOAT. But as well as the MOAT, we'll be showing you our development to use HEAT as a secure system to enable peer evaluation through sharing plans between HEAT member organisations. That's another key development that's happened in this winter technical update in relation to the evaluation plans. The evaluation plans webinar, this webinar is open to everyone, although of course it will be more relevant to HEAT members, but if you are interested in learning more about HEAT, please do come along. And a link to the webinar will be circulated after this event, or if you're a HEAT member, you will also see it come around in the HEAT bulletin. So please do sign up. And thank you, that's everything. So back to you, Rain.
Super, thank you so much, Anna. And Emma, I'm going to hand over to you to talk us through the use with MREP.
Great, thanks, Rain. So just for anybody that doesn't know, my name's Emma Church and I'm Partnership Manager for MREP, and we work with universities and UniConnect partnerships in and around the Midlands, supporting them with their targeting, monitoring, tracking and evaluation of outreach and recruitment activities. And I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about how at MREP we've been working alongside TASO to understand how we can integrate MOAT into our existing processes and procedures to best support our partners in terms of recording activities and outcomes on our database. So I think it's worth starting off by saying that at MREP, we already had our own activity typology in place, and that each partner has a tailored activity grid, which has been developed in conjunction with the core team and is mapped to our overarching activity typology. And within this typology, we have core activity types, common framework types, activity types, and sub-activity types. And at around the same time that the MOAT was initially launched, and we were working alongside TASO, OFS and the other trackers to develop the collaborative attainment-raising MOAT, we were also undertaking a review of our existing typology. And this was just to ensure that it was still relevant and capturing correct information for our partners, but also ensuring that there wasn't too much duplication or overlap between different activity types that different partners had requested on our system. So this review led to an initial streaming of our typology, which partners were consulted about and fed back on. And then following this feedback, we started the process of mapping our typology to the MOAT with the support of TASO. So it has taken some time, as I'm sure you can appreciate, but we do have a final draft, which we'll be sending out to partners following today's webinar. We've been very careful to ensure that as much consistency as possible to avoid confusion has been taken, but it is worth noting, and I think it's been said by previous panelists, that not all activities neatly align based on descriptions of the interventions that we'd previously been provided by our partners during an initial review. So that's just something that we do need to bear into consideration. So on that basis, and given that some of our partners already had established activity grids and reporting processes in place, we have taken the decision not to replace our typology with the MOAT, but instead we're going to be allowing partners the flexibility to either adopt it in its entirety or to continue to use the MREP typology, which we will then code into the MOAT based on the alignment agreed with TASO. And we think this way it will enable our partners to continue recording using their preferred method, but also, like we've mentioned, contribute to any sector analysis that will use the MOAT as the activity typology. So what our partners will notice that there are a couple of differences in terminology used across our typology and the MOAT, and I've just illustrated these on screen so that you can see what they are. So we have made some system changes on our database to incorporate the MOAT. So as normal, partners will be required to add activities through the activities section of the database, which is found as normal across the top of the homepage. And partners will only see the activity types which are linked to their inputter profile. So that's based on their lead provider status. They will then be able to log either the MOAT sub-activity types or MREP activity types, and based on these plus the common framework, we will be able to code into the MOAT activity types in the background of the database. So again, I think it's been mentioned that although the MOAT has been mapped outcomes to activities, we've decided to allow partners to log any outcome against any activity. So we feel that this will help us to understand any areas where, as mentioned, the MOAT does not fully align to current MREP activity types, and we'll obviously then be able to feed this back to TASO in due course. However, to support, we are going to be providing partners with additional checks as part of their quarterly checking process. So suggesting where outcomes have been used incorrectly based on the MOAT, thus allowing them the option to update any activities that they enter into the system, or to help provide a rationale in the activity record for the outcomes use. So as I mentioned, we'll be sending out a final draft of our mapped MREP typology to partners following today's webinar, and we're also going to be holding an ops group meeting to further provide clarification and guidance on its proposed use. So I appreciate that's a really quick whistle-stop tour, but we will be providing partners with further details in due course. Thanks, Ray.
That's super. Thank you so much, Emma. And then finally, Katie, I'm going to hand over to you to talk us through the use in the Aim Higher database.
Thank you, Rain. Hi, everyone. Again, if you've never met me before, I'm Katy. I'm Aim Higher West Midlands Evaluation Research and Data Manager, which means within my role, I'm in charge of managing our national tracker as well. Just to let you know where we are, we, much as the other trackers, have now fully integrated the attainment-raising MOAT. I'll guide you a little bit into how this is fed into recording activities and how this then feedbacks through a number of reports that you have available to you. And much like MREP, we had our own activity typology, and we are now working very hard behind the scenes to integrate, and we hope to have the full MOAT integrated somewhat soon. So I'll just guide you through the process of recording activities. So as usual, you'd click activities at the top of the homepage, and then you can select add an activity. This hasn't changed at all. But you will now be prompted with a new field called stream. So this is more of an internal field. As you know, our database is also optimized to a lot of research that we do on the side and that we can help partners with. And this field will just help filtering some of those things out. But then if under priority activity, you select skills and attainment, you will then, as you'll see in the next slide, have access to a bunch of activity types, which are the ones in the attainment-raising MOAT. So you'll see they correspond exactly to the MOAT. And once you've selected that, you can select as many as you need to the bottom box that is now empty. And then you can select your outcomes, which again, just track perfectly with the MOAT ones. We did still want to allow some flexibility. So you do have an option if you scroll down to the outcomes, which is not shown here, but you do have an option to include any bespoke outcomes. And much like MREP, we will be reviewing these with you, and we will feed this back to TASO and to OFS when we keep working collaboratively. This, of course, is not an isolated thing. So, of course, you'll do this when recording activities, but this will feed through all of our reports. So any logged activities will obviously feed through your activities report as normal. We'll have a few new fields in that report to track particularly attainment-raising activity. If you're a UCP partnership, this will filter down to all of your UCP reports in terms of engagement, any school reports. Most of our partners have access to individual learner data. You will then also be able to see for each individual learner which activities they've taken part of, what were the expected outcomes from those activities, and so on. And so this is all we've done so far with the attainment-raising MOAT. And as I said, we're now working to integrate the full MOAT onto our database, and it will be kind of similar processes, and it will feed through again to all of our reports and so on. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Katy, and thank you also to Emma and Anna for that really useful illustration of how the different codifications work for each of your services. So we have a little bit of time left to take some questions, and I can see that there are questions flowing into the Q&A box already and have been throughout the session. So I'm going to unshare the slides now and bring you back to the home screen so that you can see everybody. And we'll get through as many questions as we can, but anything we don't get through, we'll try and mop up and share with everybody who signed up for the event post webinar. So we have one question about improved reading skills. So we're thinking about the attainment-raising MOAT, and this is a question I'm going to give to you, Sarah, if that's okay. So the question is, why is improved reading skills listed as both short-term non-behavioural and intermediate behavioural?
Yeah, so you'll see actually a few outcomes like this in the MOAT where they might be in different outcome bins, as we're calling them. So to answer the sort of first part of the question, why they might be short and intermediate, is that it might be something that you measure immediately after a session, potentially through a questionnaire, just asking them if they believe their reading skills have increased. So that could be something that could change in the short term, but in more intermediate or longer term, it might be that their actual reading skills do increase, and you might assess that through a reading test. So that becomes more of a behavioural measure. So something that you can actually see physically in their behaviour, that their reading skills have improved rather than just self-reporting. So hopefully that makes sense, but it might be why you'll find a few different outcomes across different bins, because you might measure them in the short term, the intermediate term, or even the long term, depending on how you think, how quickly that those outcomes may change across time.
Super, thank you so much. And Sarah, while I've got you off mute, I'm going to bounce another question to you. We have an anonymous attendee asking, I still find the output versus outcome confusing. Is there an easier way to approach this, or does it just become easier over time? I'm sure we've all got our views on this.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, really interesting. We do a lot of theory of change workshops, and this comes up a lot. Outputs versus outcomes. It's definitely the most common sort of mix up. The way I like to think of it is an output is something you know will happen. It's a concrete output as a result of your activity, whereas outcomes are something that you want to happen, or you hope will happen. So that's how I find it easier to distinguish between the two. So an output could be something like students are exposed to the activity, they've attended a number of sessions. It's something really concrete that you know has happened. And the outcome, ideally, as you might want their knowledge to increase, but we can't say for definite that's happened. That's just ideally what we want to happen as a result of our activities.
Super, thank you so much. And then there are a couple of more practical questions. So one, somebody, an anonymous attendee is asking, the third tab on the practical spreadsheet that we demonstrated is mapping the most common outcomes to activities. And this person is asking for the references for this evidence base. As they can imagine, it will come up with colleagues. I think it's a really good question. I can start by answering that, but do feel free to pitch in, TASO colleagues. So we have a number of different evidence reviews that have fed into the development of the MOAT, basically, and they are linked on our website, but I'll make a note and actually share those explicitly in the follow-up comms as well. Basically, there are three key, what we call rapid evidence reviews, essentially kind of literature reviews that investigate or interrogate really the evidence between different activity types and the mostly association or links between those activity types and outcomes. As Sarah articulated earlier in this webinar, we don't have a lot of really robust, good causal evidence. So we've conducted the mapping based on the strongest links, or what we would think of as like correlative associations in the literature. So yeah, we'll follow up and share with that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, anybody, or Sarah and Nicolette.
No, I think that covers everything. I think just to say as well that a lot of it comes from our own experience on projects, particularly on that multi-intervention outreach evaluation that we did. So not all of it is necessarily from evidence. And as Rain points to, we don't have that much causal evidence in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so sorry, but we are less than a minute to go, and there are some questions that we haven't got to, which I could have anticipated would happen. So what I'm going to do is we'll download the Q&A function, and I'll respond to those as part of the follow-up comms in written format. So you will get a response to those in the next couple of days. But before we close, it just leaves it to me to say thank you so much to each of you who have presented and spoken today. It's been such a pleasure to work with the three national trackers and also the OFS to make sure that this is as generalizable and applicable and also implementable as it can be for the sector at the moment. It is still a work in progress. It's what we like to think of as a kind of working draft, and through the sector using these different lists and codifications over the next couple of months, years, we'll hopefully be able to build up more of an evidence bank and better interrogate or understand the causal links between these different activity types and outcomes. And I'm sure there will be iterations of the MOATs, mapping of outcomes and activity tools, to come in the future, and we'll very much keep the sector posted on that. So thank you so much to each of you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for everyone joining us online, we will follow up with the various question responses and resources and webinar links that we've referenced throughout today. Thank you so much for joining us.